In a single sentence, she stopped him cold. The studio lights burn white against the polished table, reflecting off the glass of water that no one touches. Cameras hum. The audience leans forward as Alan Dershowitz adjusts his glasses, mid-rant, his voice full of practiced certainty. Words spill from him like he's giving a lecture, not having a conversation. Every syllable is a performance of authority, slow, deliberate, meant to dominate. Across from him, Jasmine Crockett sits motionless, her hands folded, her eyes steady. She doesn't interrupt. She doesn't blink. She lets the silence grow heavier with every second he speaks. The kind of silence that makes even the cameras feel nervous. Dershowitz gestures grandly, his tone swelling. The problem with today's politicians, he declares, is that they confuse passion with knowledge. His lips curl into the faintest smile, a smirk built on decades of never being challenged by anyone who looks like her. A producer's whisper ripples through the control room. One of the commentators shifts in their seat. The air tightens. The audience can feel it that quiet before lightning hits. Then Jasmine leans forward. Just slightly. The movement alone cuts through the noise like a blade. She opens her mouth, voice calm but sharp as glass, and just before the question leaves her lips, time freezes. The screen flickers. The world holds its breath. Because this is the moment that will break the internet. The moment replayed in slow motion across millions of screens. A congresswoman from Texas facing down one of America's most untouchable legal minds. No raised voice. No theatrics. Just precision. The narrator's voice breaks through. Low and cinematic. But before we show you what she said, you need to understand why this moment changed everything. The camera pulls back, the lights dim. The chatter fades into a hum, as if the world itself is rewinding. Because to understand the question that silenced Alan Dershowitz, you first have to understand the arrogance that led to it. Long before the question echoed across the airwaves, America had been waiting for this moment, though few realized it. What unfolded on that studio stage wasn't just another political spat. It was the collision of two worlds, one built on unshakable privilege, the other on unbreakable truth. The debate had been billed as a conversation on constitutional ethics, a harmless phrase that disguised the powder keg beneath it. The panel was stacked with familiar names, men who had built careers out of dissecting justice while rarely living it. And at the center sat Alan Dershowitz, the celebrity lawyer turned professional pundit. The man whose voice had filled courtrooms and television screens for half a century. He had long mastered the art of intellectual intimidation. With his clipped cadence and confident smirk, he didn't argue. He performed certainty. He had sparred with senators, defended presidents, and built an empire out of sounding untouchable. For years, the public watched him as a symbol of elite legal power, a man who could twist morality into logic and still walk away applauded. But America was changing. The language of power no longer belonged solely to those who wore it like armor. And sitting across from him that night was a reminder of that change, Jasmine Crockett. A congresswoman forged in the fires of public service and raw honesty. Her rise wasn't cushioned by old connections or ivy-covered institutions. She came from the kind of background the establishment rarely acknowledged, one where truth had to be louder just to be heard. On social media, she was known for her fire. In Congress, for her fearlessness. In every clip that circulated online, people saw something refreshing. A woman who didn't shrink when arrogance filled the room. The matchup was almost cinematic Dershowitz, the relic of an era that prized argument over empathy, and Crockett, the voice of a generation that demanded both. He spoke in citations. She spoke in conviction. He wielded precedent. She wielded principle. From the opening moments, it was clear he underestimated her. The small tells were everywhere, the dismissive chuckle, the condescending nod, the way he kept calling her young lady instead of congresswoman. It wasn't just disrespect. It was habit. A lifetime of speaking down to anyone who dared speak up, but the audience wasn't the same as it had been in his prime. The cameras were no longer his allies. They were everyone's. Every word. Every pause, every flicker of emotion could be clipped, shared, dissected in seconds. The court of public opinion was no longer a courtroom. It was a wildfire. And in that arena, authenticity burns brighter than ego. For Jasmine, this wasn't about scoring points. It was about presence, about showing that power could look different, sound different, be different. For so long, voices like hers were filtered out of serious debates, framed as emotional rather than intellectual. Yet here she was, not just holding her ground, but rewriting the rules of engagement in real time. As Dershowitz droned on, dissecting the Constitution like it was his personal scripture, viewers felt the generational divide crack open. It wasn't just age, it was worldview. One man clinging to a past where power was inherited, one woman embodying a future where it's earned, and beneath that polite studio lighting, America saw itself reflected, torn between what it had been and what it could become. But before this storm hit live television, the seeds of conflict were already planted deep in the story of two very different lives. Once his words could move courts. Once, when Alan Dershowitz spoke, judges leaned in, students took notes, and headlines followed. He was the archetype of the American legal mind, sharp, articulate, fearless. In his youth, he carried himself like a man born for argument, the kind of intellect that could bend iron with rhetoric alone. He taught at Harvard, wrote books that filled law libraries, and built a name that stood for brilliance and bravado in equal measure. But brilliance, unchecked, breeds a different hunger. Somewhere between idealism and influence, Dershowitz stopped being a voice for justice and became a brand. The cameras that once documented his legal triumphs began to crave something else: controversy. And controversy, he learned, paid better than principle. He had defended men accused of the unforgivable, some out of duty to the Constitution, others out of sheer appetite for the stage. O.J. Simpson, Jeffrey Epstein, Donald Trump, each name heavier than the last. Each defense another brick in the wall, separating the man from the moral core he once championed. Everyone deserves a defense, he would say, his voice calm, his logic airtight. And yet beneath the cool philosophy, something darker pulsed. The thrill of proximity to power. He preached ethics on one channel while excusing them away on another. He lectured about moral consistency, but shifted his ground whenever convenience demanded. To his critics, it wasn't intellect. It was performance art. To his fans, it was courage in the face of outrage. But to the country watching, confusion took root. How could the same man who once fought for civil liberties now serve as a shield for those who abused them? It wasn't that Dershowitz stopped believing in the law. It was that he began believing in himself more than the law. Over time, every debate, every appearance became another chapter in a long-running defense of Alan Dershowitz. The defendant was no longer the client. It was his legacy, and television loved him for it. The combative professor who could out-talk anyone, the contrarian who made even truth sound negotiable. His voice still carried authority, but not reverence. It no longer inspired, it provoked. His words once carried the weight of law. Now, they echo like self-justifications, bouncing through a marble hallway. Viewers could sense it too. The subtle erosion of sincerity. There was a time when his arguments felt rooted in something noble, an almost sacred commitment to fairness. But now, each televised debate seemed to orbit around one central gravity: his ego. When he spoke of free speech, it felt less like a principle and more like armor. When he invoked the Constitution, it sounded like a shield for the powerful, not a refuge for the powerless. Still, charisma is a stubborn ghost. It clung to him, drawing cameras and controversy wherever he went. Journalists kept calling, networks kept booking, and every time he walked into a studio, he carried the gravitas of his past like a robe of untouchability. But beneath that surface polish, cracks spread. Former students whispered about disillusionment. Colleagues who once admired his courage now rolled their eyes at his theatrics. Even the public, once dazzled by his intellect, began to see the pattern the man who always defended never reflected. Dershowitz would insist that he hadn't changed, that the world had. "We live in a time," he once said, "where people confuse moral outrage with justice." Maybe he had confused self-preservation with principle. Still, he carried on the last of the old guard, the aging oracle of rationalization. He relished the role of provocateur, the man who could still ignite outrage with a few chosen words. And when the call came for this latest debate, another chance to remind America he was still relevant, he didn't hesitate. Another stage, another spotlight, another duel to prove that the old minds still ruled the new world. But for the first time in a long time, he wasn't stepping into a room of acolytes or admirers. Across the table sat someone who didn't care about his titles, his tenure, or his trophies. Someone whose truth didn't bend under pressure. And while Dershowitz basked in the comfort of television power, someone else was walking an entirely different road, one built on grit, purpose, and the voice of a new generation. Before the lights, before the headlines, before the moment that made her name echo through living rooms across America, Jasmine Crockett was a voice in the margins. The kind of lawyer who fought for people the system had already forgotten. She started out in Texas, not in glass towers or high-powered firms, but in overcrowded courtrooms that smelled of sweat, fear, and resignation. Public defense was never glamorous work. It was triage for a justice system bleeding at every seam. The clients came in one after another, young men in orange jumpsuits, mothers handcuffed in front of their children, people who never stood a chance because the system never planned for them to. Jasmine learned early that the law was supposed to be blind, but somehow it always seemed to see color, class, and power just fine. She watched prosecutors stack charges like sandbags, judges sigh through hearings like they were chores, and juries turn away when the truth got uncomfortable. Most people in her position either burned out or looked away. She said every case took something from her: a night of sleep, a piece of faith, a little more innocence, but it also gave her something back: resolve. The kind that grows only when you've seen injustice up close and still believe it can be changed. Her voice sharpened in those rooms. Her patience thinned. Her courage hardened. She learned that silence protects the powerful, and truth only matters if someone is brave enough to say it out loud. When she finally ran for office, it wasn't because she dreamed of titles or cameras. It was because she was tired of fighting from the bottom of the system. She wanted to change it from the top. Her campaign was raw, real, unpolished, driven by volunteers and believers, not donors and dynasties. She walked neighborhoods where politicians rarely went. She listened more than she spoke. And when she did speak, she didn't sound like a politician at all. She sounded like someone telling the truth. That's what drew people to her. Not polish. Not pedigree, but principle. While Dershowitz built power through prestige, Crockett built hers through presence, the kind that can't be bought or rehearsed. When she took her oath in Congress, she carried with her the faces of those she once defended, the wrongfully accused, the overcharged, the unheard. Each speech she gave, each hearing she attended, was for them. Her blunt honesty became her signature. Her refusal to conform became her armor. She didn't play the game. She rewrote the tone. And every time she spoke truth to power, America noticed. But being outspoken came at a cost. The same voice that inspired millions also provoked the establishment. She was labeled angry, unprofessional, too direct. Every adjective meant to soften her impact only amplified it. Behind closed doors, she felt the weight, the endless scrutiny, the coded insults. It's the fatigue that comes from being both underestimated and overexposed. There were nights she'd sit alone in her office, replaying moments in her head, wondering if speaking up had made a difference or just made her a target. Yet every time doubt whispered, memory answered, the faces of her old clients. The letters from young girls who saw themselves in her courage, the supporters who said, "You make me believe we still have a voice," was her fuel, not fame. Not followers, but faith in the power of ordinary people to rise when the moment calls. In a world addicted to performance, Jasmine remained painfully, beautifully real. Her rise to national recognition wasn't orchestrated. It was inevitable. When injustice is televised, authenticity becomes revolutionary. People were hungry for someone who didn't just survive the system but challenged it from within. In her, they saw that rarest of things, conviction without ego. So when she was invited to the televised panel alongside Alan Dershowitz, she knew exactly what it represented. It wasn't just another appearance. It was a stage built by the establishment, a test of how much truth the powerful could tolerate. When it came from someone they weren't used to listening to, Dershowitz would come armed with decades of rhetoric. She would come armed with reality. He had theory. She had testimony. He had prestige. She had purpose. And for the first time, the balance of moral gravity was about to shift on live television, in that green room before the cameras rolled. She centered herself, slow breath, steady pulse, calm resolve. She knew what it meant to walk into rooms not meant for her and still command them. She had done it her entire life, and then the stage was set. One voice from the courtroom of the past, another from the front lines of today, and millions ready to watch what would happen next. The debate begins like any other. Bright lights, fixed smiles, and the faint hum of tension dressed as civility. The moderator's voice introduces the guests, the decorated scholar and the congresswoman from Texas, before retreating into the neutral safety of silence. Cameras close in. The countdown ends. The red light flashes on. Alan Dershowitz starts first. Of course he does. He leans toward the microphone with the confidence of a man who's never had to earn his turn. His voice rolls out smooth, calculated, legalistic, the cadence of courtroom certainty. He doesn't debate. He declares. Each word lands like it's meant to instruct, not invite. Let's be clear, he begins, drawing the words out as if clarity itself requires his permission. Our Constitution demands reason, not emotion. Passion has its place in politics, but it has no place in law. He adjusts his tie. The host nods deferentially. The studio audience listens, polite, cautious. Dershowitz continues, warming to his own rhythm. Unfortunately, he says, glancing toward Jasmine with that patronizing half-smile, many modern lawmakers seem to have forgotten that distinction. He pauses, allowing the implication to hang in the air like cigar smoke. The camera cuts to Jasmine. Her expression is unreadable, neither offended nor impressed. Just still, watching Dershowitz mistakes her silence for surrender. He launches into a mini-lecture about the founders, about precedent, about the erosion of intellectual rigor in modern discourse. The tone isn't debate. It's dismissal wrapped in vocabulary. His sentences sprawl, peppered with citations. Each one another brick in the wall he's building between his authority and her voice. He gestures as he speaks, slicing the air with his hands, a man used to speaking uninterrupted. What concerns me, he says, is that politics today rewards noise, not nuance. It elevates outrage over understanding. And Congresswoman, he turns toward her now, his voice softening into condescension. While I respect your enthusiasm, I fear it reflects that very trend. The moderator's eyes flick toward Jasmine. The room tightens. Somewhere in the audience, someone exhales too loudly. Jasmine doesn't move. She doesn't blink. The camera lingers on her face, calm, measured, but unmistakably alive beneath the stillness. Dershowitz takes her silence as confirmation. He presses on. When we replace reason with rhetoric, he says, we degrade the very institutions we claim to defend. The law is not a weapon of emotion. It's a framework of restraint. The words hang heavy, rehearsed. Polish the performance of a man long, accustomed to controlling every narrative he enters. But something is shifting. The host glances from one guest to the other, sensing the current change direction. The audience leans in, not for Dershowitz's monologue, but for what they can feel coming. Because Jasmine's silence isn't absence, it's energy. Gathering, the camera cuts closer to her face. She inhales slowly, eyes steady, the faintest trace of a smile ghosting across her lips. The kind of smile that says, I hear you. I've heard all of this before, and now it's my turn. Dershowitz keeps talking, unaware he's already lost control of the room. The problem, he says, voice swelling, is that too many politicians think feeling strongly makes them right. But in law, feelings are irrelevant. Finishes, sits back, self-satisfied. The host begins to pivot. Congresswoman Crockett, but Jasmine's already leaning forward. The audience feels it, that subtle shift in gravity, the moment before thunder. Her voice cuts through the air, clear, calm, deliberate. "Professor," she begins. Her tone respectful but edged with quiet precision. "You've spent your life defending the letter of the law. But tell me, the pause is surgical. Every heartbeat in the room seems to wait for the next word." She continues. "At what point does the law stop defending justice and start protecting power?" The studio falls silent. Dershowitz blinks, caught mid-breath. For the first time, he doesn't have a prepared answer. The cameras zoom in, catching everything: the flicker of uncertainty behind his glasses, the faint tightening of his jaw, the faint murmur rippling through the crowd, and Jasmine just sits there, composed, her gaze locked on his. He thought the debate was his until one question shattered the illusion. The silence that follows is thick enough to feel. It stretches across the studio like a drawn breath that no one dares release. Every pair of us audience, camera crew, moderator, locks on Alan Dershowitz. He opens his mouth, closes it again. For a man whose entire career has been built on words, it's the absence of them that suddenly betrays him. The question still hangs there, clear and unshakable. At what point does the law stop defending justice and start protecting power? It isn't loud, isn't theatrical, but it cuts through decades of rhetoric with the sharpness of a single truth. Dershowitz blinks. His fingers twitch against the table. The lights seem harsher now, exposing every bead of sweat. He chuckles softly, that nervous professorial laugh he uses when he's buying time. "Well," he says, voice cracking slightly, That's a complicated question, Congresswoman." But everyone can hear it. The hesitation, the stumble, the erosion of confidence. Jasmine doesn't move. Her gaze stays locked, calm and unwavering. "It's a simple question," she says softly. "Complicated answers are how people hide from simple truths." The crowd murmurs, just a ripple at first, then swelling into low electric energy. The moderator glances from one to the other, as if unsure whether to intervene or simply let history unfold. Dershowitz shifts in his seat, tries again. "Look, the role of the law is to..." He stops, gesturing vaguely, as if the words will materialize if he moves his hands fast enough. "To ensure due process, to protect rights whose rights." She interrupts, still calm, still surgical. "Because in every case you've defended, it seems like the people with the most money, the most power, the most friends in high places somehow end up being the ones the law protects most fiercely." Another silence. This one lands heavier. Dershowitz inhales sharply, his practiced charm faltering. "I defend the Constitution," he says, voice rising an octave. "Not individuals. Principles, not personalities." "But you choose the individuals," she replies. "And those choices tell a story too." The moderator looks stunned. The studio feels like a courtroom now, with Jasmine as the quiet prosecutor dismantling the myth of the untouchable professor. Dershowitz leans forward, his tone defensive now, his words tumbling faster. "Congresswoman, with all due respect, I have spent my entire life standing for the law, even when it's unpopular. And yet, somehow, you've always managed to stand with the powerful while doing it." There's a sound, then an audible gasp, somewhere from the back of the room. A producer's headset crackles with whispered astonishment. Dershowitz's lips part, but nothing comes out. His eyes dart toward the moderator, searching for rescue that doesn't arrive. The camera zooms in. His face fills the screen. His composure fractures piece by piece. Across America, the moment freezes. Clips are already being recorded on phones in the audience. On social media, captions will appear before the segment even finishes airing. She ended him with one question, Dershowitz speechless. Jasmine Crockett, the moment she became the voice of reason. Back in the studio, Dershowitz tries to regain footing. I think he starts, clearing his throat, "I think we're confusing advocacy with endorsement. My job has always been to defend unpopular clients, but why are the unpopular ones always rich?" She asks quietly. That does it. The line detonates in the room. The audience reacts instinctively. Gasp. Others laugh, others simply stare. Even the moderator hides a smirk behind a cough. Jasmine doesn't push further. She doesn't need to. Her restraint is more powerful than any attack. She just sits there, letting the silence do what justice rarely gets to speak for itself. Dershowitz shifts again, papers rustling nervously in front of him. "You're mischaracterizing my work," he insists, his words tumbling into one another. "You're simplifying this as a distortion." Jasmine tilts her head, empathy flickering across her face. "No," she says softly. "It's just a mirror." The reaction is immediate. A low murmur rolls through the audience like thunder from far away. On the monitors, producers can see live comments already exploding online. "She cooked him. This is historic." That's how you hold power accountable. Even the moderator finally gives up trying to hide the smile. Dershowitz exhales, defeated. "I don't appreciate being misrepresented," he says quietly, but the conviction is gone. Jasmine doesn't answer. She just nods once, acknowledging the end of his reign without gloating, without victory laps. It's not about winning. It's about truth. And for the first time in a long time, the truth feels louder than the noise. The cameras capture everything. His slumped shoulders, her steady poise, the collective realization that something irreversible has just happened. The torch has passed not through ceremony, but through clarity, across living rooms. Viewers who've long felt unheard sit up straighter. Immigrants, students, workers. Mother cell watching a woman who looks like them dismantle the illusion of untouchable power without raising her voice. Within minutes, clips go viral. Hashtags ignite like fireworks. Hashtag Jasmine Crockett. Hashtag mic drop. Hashtag power and principle. Commentators scramble to react, some praising her brilliance, others calling it disrespect. But the debate doesn't matter. The moment already belongs to her, because what people witnessed wasn't just a takedown. It was a shift. The intellectual emperor dethroned not by shouting, but by composure. The professor rendered speechless by the very logic he once weaponized. And in that silence brief, fragile perfects something larger than politics happens. Dignity defeats dominance. Truth outshines ego. The camera lingers on Jasmine's face, the faint glint of resolve in her eyes. Then the narrator's voice breaks the quiet, low and reverent. But what happened after that question? No one, not even she, could have predicted. Within hours, the clip was everywhere, not just trending, dominating. Every corner of the internet lit up with the same headline: Crockett versus Dershowitz. The 10-second exchange captured in perfect clarity became a cultural lightning strike. On Twitter, on every platform that thrives on the energy of defiance, the hashtags erupted. Hashtag Crockett question, hashtag mic drop justice, hashtag power and principle. Thousands of comments flooded in. She said what we've all been wanting to say. This is what accountability looks like. History just blinked. By midnight, the video had been remixed, captioned, slowed down, and replayed in every possible way. One viral edit froze on Jasmine's calm expression while the caption read, "When silence speaks louder than credentials." Another looped Dershowitz's stammer, overlaid with thunderclaps and dramatic orchestral music. The internet had turned a single question into a movement. Cable news scrambled to catch up. Every panel, every pundit, every think piece had to weigh in. On the progressive networks, commentators leaned forward in admiration. That wasn't just a debate, one host declared. That was the sound of a generation refusing to defer to gatekeepers. But elsewhere, the tone was defensive, condescending, disrespectful, some said, unprofessional. Others called it a symptom of declining civility. The same old phrases that power always uses when it's been challenged by someone who was never supposed to have the mic. And yet, the audience could feel the shift. Something tectonic had moved. Clips of young law students quoting Jasmine's line began circulating. Teachers shared it in classrooms. Activists posted reaction videos, tears in their eyes, saying, "That's how you do it. That's how you make them listen." In living rooms across the country, families rewatched the moment like it was a championship replay. The underdog had won, not by overpowering, but by outthinking. Talk radio shows tried to frame it differently. Dershowitz is a legend, one host argued. He doesn't need to dignify that question. But callers weren't buying it. If he's such a legend, one woman said, why couldn't he answer?
Ow.
The tension rippled into op-eds. One headline read, "The day the ivory tower cracked." Another, from a conservative columnist, countered, "The cult of outrage strikes again." But the truth was simpler. The world had just seen the balance of intellectual power tip toward a new voice. One unafraid of sacred reputations, by the next morning even the memes had evolved into manifestos. A still image of Jasmine Crockett lifted. Eyes steady circulated with the caption, "While they talk about the law, she talks about justice." It wasn't just entertainment anymore. It was identity. In that echo chamber of digital noise, one thing became clear. People weren't just watching a political debate. They were watching the symbolic undoing of an old order. Professors on law podcasts debated whether her question was fair. Students on TikTok debated whether fairness was even the point. Commentators on late-night shows joked about Dershowitz's pause, but under the laughter was reverence. Everyone felt it, even if they couldn't quite say it out loud. Something about that moment rang true. Because in an age where information moves faster than accountability, the sight of an unflinching truth-teller holding power still felt revolutionary. As hours turned to days, the story mutated from news cycle to cultural parable. Young journalists called it the Crockett Doctrine. Politicians tweeted their support, some out of conviction, others out of fear of missing the wave. Hashtags became banners, threads became essays, reaction videos became modern sermons about courage, and through it all, Jasmine said nothing. No victory lap, no interview tour. It's just a single post, an understated message that read, "Truth doesn't need volume. It just needs a voice." The post hit 1 million likes in under an hour. Meanwhile, Dershowitz appeared on a talk show days later, attempting to explain himself. "I wasn't silenced," he said with a tight smile. "I was being thoughtful." But the clip of that moment, the faltering pause, the eyes searching for words, kept replaying beside him. Like a ghost, he couldn't out-talk. The establishment closed ranks, but the narrative had already escaped their grasp. The people had chosen their story. A young congresswoman's composure had. It's become a mirror for a country tired of being lectured by those who mistake credentials for wisdom. And so the story evolved beyond politics, beyond personalities. It became a parable about time. About generations, about who gets to define truth when the old voices falter. As one viral tweet put it, summing up the collective feeling, that wasn't disrespect, it was history correcting itself. But for Jasmine, this wasn't about likes or retweets. It was about something deeper, a truth that too many still refused to face. The storm of headlines began to fade, but Jasmine Crockett's question lingered like an echo, refusing to die. When reporters finally caught up with her outside the Capitol, she didn't posture or boast. She simply said, "It's not about winning an argument. It's about holding the mirror steady, even when people don't like what they see."
Ow.
There was no smirk, no triumph, just calm conviction. The same steadiness that silenced a man who'd spent a lifetime defining the rules. Later that week, she spoke briefly at a community town hall, a small gathering in Texas. Auditorium filled with folding chairs and ordinary people. No cameras, no grand production. "Power," she told them, "isn't what you have, it's what you use it for. If you use it to lift others, it multiplies. If you use it to shield yourself, it withers." The crowd applauded softly, but the message hit deeper than sound. It was a truth that belonged to everyone in that room. To everyone who had ever been talked over or underestimated, the narrator's voice would later capture that feeling perfectly in a country drowning in noise. The quiet question becomes a thunderclap. Not because it shouts, but because it cuts through the static of ego and reminds us what clarity sounds like. That's what Jasmine's moment became, a mirror held up to a nation addicted to loudness. For every pundit who tried to twist it into theater, millions saw something purer, a woman who refused to bend her truth to fit someone else's comfort. Commentators called it the resurgence of moral courage. Young activists called it permission to question, to speak, stand tall, even when told to sit down. Her words were no longer just hers. They'd become part of a larger vocabulary of justice, of dignity, of the unspoken belief that truth doesn't need to shout to be heard. Somewhere, Dershowitz continued making appearances, still defending, still talking, but the energy had shifted. The air of authority he once carried no longer felt inevitable. The question, her question, had become a kind of checkpoint in the public consciousness. Every argument that followed had to pass through it, and that was the quiet victory. Because this story was never about humiliation. It was about evolution. About the courage it takes to speak truth to a system built to outtalk you. About the idea that intellect isn't measured in volume, but in integrity. The moral wasn't partisan. It was profoundly human. Dignity is louder than dominance. Humility outlasts arrogance. And the truth, when spoken with purpose, ways finds its way to the surface. Jasmine Crockett reminded a country that power without conscience is just noise, that justice without empathy is just performance. And that sometimes the most revolutionary act is not to shout over someone, but to wait for them to run out of excuses. In that waiting, in that silence, she reclaimed the space for truth. And as the applause faded and screens went dark, one thing was certain: America had just witnessed a turning point. One question, one moment, one truth. That's all it took for the noise to break and for clarity to flood in. Jasmine Crockett's calm defiance became more than a viral clip. It became a reflection of something bigger stirring across the country. A reminder that even in a world built on spectacle, authenticity still cuts through. Because courage, when spoken aloud, doesn't just echo, it multiplies. It finds new voices, new faces, new believers. If her words made you pause, if they stirred something in you, it's because courage recognizes itself. It's contagious. This isn't just about politics. It's about principle. About choosing dignity over dominance, truth over tradition, progress over the comfort of silence. Every generation inherits a choice: to keep quiet and maintain the illusion, or to speak up and break it. If you felt the power of that moment, if you saw yourself in her calm, in her clarity, in her refusal to yield, don't let it end here. Share it. Talk about it. Carry it. Because silence only ever serves the powerful, and truth only lives when it's spoken. This story wasn't about one debate. It was about who gets to define what justice sounds like. And now, that mic doesn't belong to the few, it belongs to anyone brave enough to ask the hard questions. So if her voice resonated with you, make it echo. Subscribe, share, and keep the truth alive, because every view, every conversation, every act of courage keeps that question ringing in the halls of power. She didn't just silence him. She reminded America who really holds the mic.